The dull thud of the gavel echoed through the grand auction hall, punctuating the end of another exorbitant sale. The air hung heavy with perfume, whiskey, and privilege as the elite of the equestrian world shifted restlessly in their seats, ready for the evening's final offering. What happened next would change everything. A secret worth millions, hidden in the most unexpected place, about to transform the lives of everyone in that room. The doors at the back of the arena swung open, and a collective murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd as Shadow entered the ring. Shadow's coat was dull and marred with scars, telling silent stories of hardship and neglect. The auctioneer's voice rang out, desperate to spark interest, but the crowd remained unmoved. Laughter rippled through the room as someone muttered that the horse wasn't worth a dime. Whispers grew louder, laced with ridicule. A woman in a designer dress remarked with disdain that the animal looked like it had given up on life. Others nodded, their judgments sharp and final. In that grand, glittering hall, it was clear that this animal didn't belong. It was a spectacle of rejection, and no one spared it a second thought. Until the unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor, breaking the rhythm of cruel remarks. A young woman dressed in plain clothes, out of place amidst the polished crowd, stood up. Her voice was steady, though not loud, as she placed the minimum bid. Heads turned in disbelief, but the woman ignored the chuckles and shaking heads. Her eyes were fixed on Shadow, and there was something in her expression that silenced even the harshest critics. The room fell into an uneasy quiet as she approached the ring. After completing the payment, the woman walked up to the horse, crouching down to meet its gaze. Shadow flinched, but didn't turn away. She leaned closer, whispering something softly, words no one else could hear. To everyone's shock, the horse's ears twitched, and for the first time that night, it lifted its head. The crowd exchanged bewildered glances. Victor Montgomery watched from the shadows of a support column, his eyes narrowing with recognition. 3 years had passed since Richard Harrington's disappearance, and the last thing anyone had seen was Richard with this very horse. Victor knew there was more to Shadow than met the eye. The horse that everyone had dismissed might hold the key to the $20 million that had vanished along with Richard. The unexpected bid silenced the room, a moment that would later be remembered as the beginning of everything. Elena Matthews stood at the back of the auction hall, her simple attire a stark contrast to the sea of designer suits and glittering jewelry surrounding her. Her eyes never left Shadow as she raised her hand, offering the minimum bid for a horse everyone else had deemed worthless. The wealthy crowd exchanged glances, some snickering behind manicured hands, others watching with mild curiosity at this strange woman who wanted the broken-down animal. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a finality that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later be recognized as the sound of fate shifting into place. Elena moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, ignoring the whispers that followed her. The auction's elite parted reluctantly, some wrinkling their noses, as if her presence somehow tainted the rarefied air of their exclusive world. She kept her face neutral, revealing nothing of the desperate hope pounding in her chest. This wasn't about rescuing a neglected animal, though Shadow certainly deserved better. This was about something far more significant, a truth buried beneath scars and forgotten dignity. At the payment counter, Elena counted out crisp bills from an envelope, her movements unhurried despite the weight of what she was undertaking. The auction clerk barely looked at her, processing the transaction with bored efficiency, unaware he was documenting a pivotal moment in a story that would soon rock the foundations of the equestrian elite. Behind her, a tall man with graying temples observed every movement, his phone already at his ear, voice low and urgent. As Elena approached Shadow in the holding area, the horse seemed to sense something in her that others had missed. He lifted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as she extended her hand. The stable hand who had been tasked with leading the unwanted animal away looked surprised at the horse's response. Shadow, who had stood so still and defeated in the auction ring, now watched Elena with something akin to recognition in his deep brown eyes. The fluorescent lights of the stable area cast harsh shadows across Shadow's car's shadow-scarred body as Elena ran her fingers gently over his neck, feeling for something only she knew to look for. Her breath caught when her fingertips detected the subtle, deliberate pattern hidden beneath the coarse hair, confirmation that her desperate gamble hadn't been in vain. The coded message was still there, preserved on the one living witness to a crime that had shattered lives and stolen millions. Secrets hung heavy in the air of Millfield's elite equestrian circle, spreading faster than wildfire as Elena led Shadow through the vaulted exit doors of Thornwood Auction House. The rejected horse that sold for a pittance now carried with him whispers of intrigue, each step away from the auction block cementing the mystery that would soon unravel a web of deceit, 3 years in the making. Behind every curious glance and hushed comment lurked the growing suspicion that this woman knew something about Shadow that the wealthy bidders had overlooked, something worth far more than money could measure. As Elena led Shadow toward the exit, Victor Montgomery slipped out his phone, capturing her image. The woman who had purchased a seemingly worthless horse had just become the most interesting person in his investigation. Little did anyone know that the rejected auction horse and the plain-dressed woman were about to expose a truth worth killing for. As the auction crowd began to disperse, Victor slipped away, following at a discreet distance. He watched as Elena loaded Shadow into a modest trailer hitch to an aging pickup truck, transportation that stood out starkly against the luxury vehicles filling the parking lot. The efficiency of her movements, the gentle but purposeful way she handled the horse, all pointed to someone who knew exactly what she was doing. When she drove away, Victor made no attempt to follow, instead turning to the valet with instructions to bring his car around. Victor Montgomery stood motionless near the refreshment table, his reputation as one of the country's foremost horse trainers giving him the perfect cover to observe without question. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes never left Elena's retreating form. 3 years ago, Richard Harrington had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a scandal that had rocked the financial world and accusations of embezzled millions. The last time Victor had seen his former business partner was at these very stables, Richard's hand resting on Shadow's neck, his expression grave as he spoke of dangers and evidence that needed safeguarding. The champagne in Victor's glass remained untouched as he pulled out his phone, fingers moving swiftly across the screen. Elena Matthews. The name meant nothing to him, but her deliberate actions spoke volumes. No one purchased a broken-down horse at a high society auction without reason. The woman had barely glanced at any other lot all evening, her attention fixed solely on Shadow from the moment she entered. Victor's instincts, honed through decades of reading people and animals alike, screamed that she wasn't just some soft-hearted rescuer. Inside his vehicle, Victor accessed a private database, searching for any connection between Elena Matthews and Richard Harrington. The results showed nothing obvious, but something about her seemed hauntingly familiar. Perhaps she was using a false name, or perhaps the connection was more obscure. Either way, Victor was certain of one thing: the horse that everyone had dismissed as worthless was somehow connected to Richard's disappearance and the missing millions. Shadow wasn't just a horse. He was a key to unlocking a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. The hidden truth revealed itself beneath the surface. A coded message etched onto living flesh that would unravel a 3-year-old mystery and expose a deception worth millions. Elena's hands trembled as the last of the matted hair washed away from Shadow's neck, exposing what appeared at first glance to be random scarring, but upon closer inspection, formed an intricate pattern that defied natural explanation. The warm water cascaded down the horse's neck, carrying away years of neglect and revealing the deliberate markings that had been hidden beneath layers of dirt and unkempt hair. This wasn't coincidence or accident. It was a message, carefully preserved on the most overlooked carrier imaginable. The evening light filtered through the worn slats of Elena's modest barn, casting golden beams across Shadow's glistening coat. For 3 weeks, since bringing him home from the auction, Elena had worked tirelessly, slowly building trust with gentle hands and endless patience. The horse that had stood defeated in the auction ring now watched her with alert eyes, his posture gradually shifting from resignation to quiet dignity. But it wasn't just his spirit that was emerging from beneath years of mistreatment. Elena's fingers traced the pattern carefully, her breath catching as she recognized what others had missed. The markings formed no natural pattern, instead creating a sequence of small lines, dots, and curves that seemed almost like writing. Her years studying cryptography alongside Richard hadn't been wasted. She recognized a cipher when she saw one. Shadow stood perfectly still, as if understanding the gravity of what Elena had discovered. The cool evening air raised goosebumps on Elena's arms as she led Shadow back to his stall, her mind racing with possibilities. Richard had always been brilliant, always thinking several steps ahead of everyone else. When accusations of embezzlement surfaced against him, she alone had believed in his innocence. His final message to her before disappearing had been cryptic. The truth hides in plain sight, waiting for eyes that know how to see. She had spent 3 years searching, never imagining the answer would come in the form of a rejected auction horse bearing hidden markings. In the small office adjoining the barn, Elena carefully documented each marking, photographing and sketching the patterns, until a full cipher emerged. Numbers, coordinates, banking codes. Richard had encoded everything needed to clear his name onto the one thing no one would think to examine. She worked through the night, translating each symbol, the pieces of a complex puzzle gradually revealing themselves. By dawn, Elena knew 2 things with absolute certainty. Richard Harrington had been framed, and whoever had orchestrated his downfall would kill to keep their secret hidden. The midnight intruder, standing in Shadow's stall, shattered the fragile peace Elena had carefully built, revealing that the $1 million secret wasn't just encoded on the horse's skin, but woven through a conspiracy that had claimed lives and fortunes. Moonlight filtered through the barn's high windows, casting Victor Montgomery's tall silhouette against the weathered wood as Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man who had watched her so intently at the auction now stood beside Shadow, his fingers tracing the same patterns she had discovered days before, his expression a mixture of wonder and grim confirmation. The horse remained unusually calm under his touch, as if recognizing something in this stranger that Elena couldn't yet see. Elena moved silently across the straw-covered floor, her hand sliding toward the pitchfork, leaning against a nearby stall. Victor sensed her presence before she could reach it, turning slowly with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. His eyes held no malice, only a deep, haunting sadness that made her hesitate. The tension between them stretched taut as a wire as Victor explained his connection to Richard Harrington, former business partners, friends since childhood, until the scandal that had torn everything apart. The barn seemed to hold its breath as Victor revealed what the authorities had never made public: Richard's final meeting at the stables, his frantic warning about evidence he had hidden, his absolute certainty that he was being framed. Shadow had been Richard's prized possession, a gift from his late father and the one thing he truly treasured beyond his reputation. The last security footage ever captured of Richard Harrington showed him with this very horse, carefully grooming its neck in long, deliberate strokes. Elena's suspicions wavered as Victor described the Richard he had known: brilliant, methodical, with an almost obsessive attention to detail. A man who had always prepared for contingencies, who would never flee without leaving a way to vindicate himself. Victor's voice grew hoarse as he recounted the accusations that had surfaced after Richard's disappearance. $20 million missing from client accounts, doctored records pointing unequivocally to embezzlement, the rapid dismantling of everything Richard had built. Shadow shifted in his stall, drawing both their attentions back to the markings that now held new significance. Elena's mind raced, reassessing everything she had decoded so far. The coordinates she had extracted pointed to locations she hadn't yet identified, but with Victor's knowledge of Richard's properties and investments, the pieces might finally align. The banking code suddenly made sense not as access to stolen funds, but as pathways to evidence that could expose the real criminals. The night air grew colder as Elena realized the full danger of what they had discovered. If Shadow held the key to clearing Richard's name and recovering the missing millions, then whoever had orchestrated the fraud wouldn't hesitate to eliminate both the horse and anyone who understood the secret hidden in plain sight on his neck. The game had just become deadlier, and dawn would bring decisions that neither of them could face alone. The coded markings on Shadow's neck transformed from mysterious scars into a roadmap leading straight to vindication and $20 million as Elena revealed her true connection to Richard Harrington. The midnight confrontation in the barn had shifted into an unlikely alliance, with Elena finally trusting Victor enough to share her own story, how she had worked alongside Richard for years, developing encryption systems for financial institutions until the day everything collapsed around them. The horse stood quietly between them as dawn's first light filtered through the barn windows, illuminating the intricate pattern that held the key to clearing an innocent man's name and exposing a betrayal that had shattered lives and stolen fortunes. The small office adjacent to the barn became their war room, walls soon covered with photographs, notes, and maps, as Elena and Victor worked to decrypt a message Richard had so ingeniously hidden. Shadow's markings weren't random. They formed a sophisticated cipher that only someone intimately familiar with Richard's encryption methods could possibly recognize. Each dot, line, and subtle scar represented a piece of a complex puzzle, one that Richard had literally embedded into the one being he trusted completely, knowing that eventually the right person would see what others overlooked. Elena's fingers moved swiftly across her laptop keyboard, translating the first section of code into geographical coordinates. Victor leaned forward, recognition dawning on his weathered face as he identified a property in the Adirondacks, a hunting cabin registered under a shell company that only he and Richard had known about. The second sequence revealed banking protocols, access codes to offshore accounts that had remained untouched for 3 years. Not stolen funds as the authorities had claimed, but evidence meticulously gathered and preserved. As morning stretched into afternoon, the full brilliance of Richard's plan became clear. He had documented everything: transfers made without his authorization, falsified signatures, board meeting minutes that had been altered. Every piece of evidence required to prove his innocence had been secured and hidden, with Shadow serving as the living key. The horse that no one wanted had carried within his very flesh the most valuable secret imaginable, truth that could not be hacked, stolen, or destroyed by conventional means. Shadow shifted in his stall, his once dull eyes now alert and watchful, as Elena and Victor pieced together the final elements of the cipher. The markings on his neck had been just the beginning. They pointed to more evidence hidden at specific locations, creating a chain that, when followed completely, would expose not just Richard's innocence, but identify the actual architects of the fraud. The last piece of the code revealed something neither of them had expected: proof that Richard Harrington was still alive, waiting for the moment when his name could be cleared and justice finally served. The million-dollar secret hidden in Shadow's markings transformed overnight from a desperate hope into a deadly target. As word leaked into the exclusive world of the equestrian elite, the rejected auction horse suddenly became the most coveted animal in the country, his value no longer measured in breeding potential, but in the encrypted fortune his scarred body carried. Elena woke to the sound of splintering wood, her heart racing as she grabbed the shotgun, leaning against her bedroom wall, and raced toward the barn, already knowing what she would find. The padlock had been shattered, the door flung wide, and a black SUV was speeding away down her gravel driveway, leaving nothing but disturbed dust and a terrified stable hand who had arrived early for his morning shift. Shadow stood trembling in his stall, eyes wide with fear, blood trickling from a shallow cut on his flank where someone had attempted to tranquilize him. The horse had fought back fiercely, his newfound strength and trust giving him the courage to resist what his previous broken spirit might have surrendered to. Elena ran her hands over him, checking for serious injuries, her mind racing through who might have discovered their secret and how much time they had left. The coded markings remained intact, the hidden message still secure, but the sanctuary of her small farm had been violated. By mid-morning, the threats had evolved from physical to financial. Preston Harlow, the auction house owner, who had openly mocked Shadow just weeks before, arrived in a gleaming Mercedes, his previously dismissive expression replaced with calculated interest. The offer came wrapped in false concern. $1 million for the horse. Immediate payment, no questions asked. Elena's refusal was met first with disbelief, then with thinly veiled threats about the dangers of keeping such a valuable animal with such inadequate security. Victor arrived as Harlow's car disappeared down the driveway, his usually composed face tight with urgency. The break-in at Elena's farm wasn't isolated. His own home had been ransacked, his computer stolen, files missing. Someone had connected the dots. Someone who understood exactly what Shadow represented, and who stood to lose everything if the truth came to light. Security cameras at the neighboring properties had captured glimpses of the same black SUV outside Victor's house, confirming their worst fears. The same people were hunting both them and the evidence encoded on Shadow's neck. As dusk settled over the farm, Elena and Victor worked feverishly to transfer Shadow to a new location. The coordinates they had decoded pointed to a secluded property in the mountains, a place Richard had established years ago as a contingency, unknown to his business associates. They loaded the horse into Victor's trailer, disguising him with temporary dye and false markings, a desperate attempt to hide the very thing that made him priceless. The clock was ticking, not just for their safety, but for the chance to finally unveil the truth that Richard had sacrificed everything to preserve. The hidden evidence buried deep within Shadow's coded markings finally revealed its secrets, leading Elena and Victor to a truth far more shocking than either could have imagined. The remote mountain cabin, reached only after hours of treacherous driving along winding dirt roads, stood weathered but resolute against the wilderness, much like Shadow himself had endured years of neglect, while protecting the explosive truth etched into his flesh. Inside, beneath a loose floorboard, exactly matching the coordinates decrypted from the horse's neck markings, lay a waterproof case containing everything Richard Harrington had risked his life to preserve: meticulous documentation of betrayal, orchestrated by his most trusted business partner, Alexander Whitfield, the same man who had casually consigned Shadow to the auction block, believing the horse was nothing more than a worthless reminder of a problem he had permanently solved. The cabin's dust-filled air seemed to thicken as Elena spread the documents across the rough-hewn table. Bank statements, unaltered board minutes, email exchanges, and voice recordings painted a damning picture of calculated treachery. Alexander had systematically siphoned funds from client accounts over years, doctoring records and carefully constructing a paper trail that implicated Richard. When Richard had begun noticing discrepancies, Alexander accelerated his plan, framing his partner completely before forcing him to disappear. The final evidence was the most devastating photographs, showing Alexander meeting with known criminals the day before Richard vanished, along with receipts for industrial chemicals and a remote property purchase that suggested a far darker fate than mere embezzlement. Shadow stood quietly by the cabin's window, his breath fogging the glass as Victor accessed the banking codes embedded in the second part of the horse's coded markings. The offshore account opened before them contained not just the stolen $20 million, but additional funds that Alexander had accumulated through years of fraud, over $30 million in total, meticulously tracked and documented by Richard before he disappeared. The account remained untouched, a financial time capsule waiting for the right moment to deliver justice. Elena's hands trembled as she realized the full scope of what Richard had accomplished. He hadn't just preserved evidence of his innocence, he had created an unbreakable chain of proof that would dismantle Alexander's entire criminal empire. The peaceful silence of the mountain retreat shattered as headlights swept across the cabin windows. Shadow's ears pricked forward, his body tensing as gravel crunched under approaching tires. Elena and Victor exchanged alarmed glances, quickly gathering the documents. They had been followed, perhaps tracked through Elena's phone or Victor's vehicle. The million-dollar secret they had uncovered was about to become a desperate fight for survival, with Shadow standing once again at the center of a battle between truth and those who would kill to keep it buried. The coastal town where Richard Harrington had constructed his new life seemed almost deliberately ordinary, a perfect backdrop for a man determined to disappear until the truth could safely emerge. The million-dollar secret that had been carried in the scars on Shadow's neck had finally completed its journey, bringing Elena and Victor face to face with the man who had orchestrated perhaps the most ingenious evidence preservation plan in history. Richard stood on the weathered porch of a modest blue cottage, his appearance altered by years and deliberate changes, but his eyes reflecting immediate recognition as Shadow stepped from the trailer. The horse that everyone had rejected, the living document of truth that had withstood years of neglect, nickered softly at the sight of his former owner. The reunion happened in quiet dignity, with Richard's fingers tracing the coded markings he had so carefully created, each touch an acknowledgement of what this magnificent animal had endured to carry his message. Alexander Whitfield had already been arrested, the evidence gathered from Shadow's markings and the mountain cabin creating an unbreakable case. The $30 million recovered from the offshore accounts would be returned to the clients who had lost their investments, with additional damages from Alexander's seized assets. Justice had found its way through the most unlikely of messengers. Weeks later, the same auction house that had once echoed with mockery of Shadow became the setting for a very different kind of gathering. Elena stood at the podium, her simple attire now a choice rather than a limitation, as she announced the formation of the Second Chance Foundation, funded by a portion of the recovered millions that Richard had insisted on dedicating to this purpose. The foundation would specialize in rescuing and rehabilitating auction horses that others had deemed worthless. The elite of the equestrian world who had once laughed now listened in respectful silence, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they recalled their cruel dismissal of Shadow. Preston Harlow, the auction house owner who had offered $1 million for Shadow in desperation, now signed the papers, making his establishment the official partner of the foundation. Though his motivation might have been more about salvaging his reputation than genuine remorse, the outcome would benefit countless forgotten horses. In the paddock outside, Shadow stood tall, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, all signs of neglect erased by proper care and the restoration of his dignity. Beside him stood Richard, once again using his real name, his hand resting lightly on the horse that had carried his redemption through years of darkness. The story of Shadow, the rejected auction horse, who carried $1 million secret, spread far beyond the equestrian community, becoming a powerful reminder that value exists where people fail to look, and that true worth cannot be measured by appearance alone. What began as a desperate bid on an unwanted horse had evolved into a mission that would transform countless lives, both human and equine, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary truths come hidden in the most ordinary packages. If you enjoyed this incredible story of Shadow and his $1 million secret, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing tales of horses that changed lives forever. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.